how many are the seniors in school students? Seniors, just raise your hand. Ah, wow. 2 words. What a relief and congratulations, right? I'm sure everybody is relieved to get your admission for college. Well, congratulations. It is a big step for your adulthood. Because I'm a father of a senior. I've been through all the last few months of anxiety for applying American college. So the other thing I like to say is that to talk to you, I feel so close because in the last almost 4 years, I learned American from the eyes of my boy. He's a high school student. So that's pretty much amazing for me. So the first panel talking about the learning, the information, I think it's absolutely necessary. And having said all this, I think the last 2 sections has already done their juicy part because they mentioned the orange here. Now you come to the dry part, the national security. Be sitting with the 2 Army officers, a retired general. I'm a civilian. But you will see how a civilian look at the national security. Well, what I like to do, first of all, everybody is talking about the buzzword. Think globally, act locally. This is also the panel I like to do in this session. I'll just the general layout. What is the general framework I see this world? What is the security concern for all of us? Not just for China, but also for America, but also other people in Africa, all over the world. How do I see that? What is at stake? And secondly, what are the tools available to address those issues? And then probably I'll spend a couple of minutes addressing some hot issues, like the Korean nuclear issues and the Iranian nuclear issues and others. Of course, final words will be how China and the U.S. cooperate to make it a win-win scenario in the future. So this is the framework I'll do in this session. But I'll keep it pretty brief so that we can have some question time. First, let's look at what is happening in the world and where we are heading to the future. I think everybody, not only I myself as an analyst in the embassy, and also I think all of you are also participants. You have to think about where we are heading in this world. I think just when the Cold War collapsed, everybody experienced a kind of exuberant triumphalism of the collapse of the Cold War. But very soon we find ourselves, we have a growing concern and a trouble about the uncertainty of this world. Because we have seen so many things happen we never expected before, right? Even today, you can name a great deal, and they are still coming unexpectedly. This is one of the buzzwords people use to describe the security concern of this world. They are the threats without passport. So they're afraid to travel transnational, and you really got no clue where that will happen. What are they? You have like these panels, the 2 important keywords, terrorism, lung proliferation, and a lot, pandemic disease, tsunami, earthquake, natural disasters, and even what is happening, for example, in Japan, the nuclear radiation. All this we never experienced before, and probably something happened in Chernobyl years ago. We soon forgot. Our memories are pretty short sometimes. So these are the threats without passport. That can happen anywhere. So are we prepared to confront all these threats and securities? And now there are three things that interact with each other. I think it's very important to define the framework, how we look at the security issues. One is the traditional security perspective. That is, the countries just among powers, traditional powers, they are seeking for hegemon, they are seeking for advantage over another. It's purely a zero-sum game. Then the non-traditional security concerns, this is what we confront most, is when we face so many transnational threats, a country, no matter how powerful it is, by no means it can address the issue solely. We got to work together. We got to work together. No plan B, no alternative. Then what is the third one? The third one actually is the domestic politics. They also play a part, right? So that makes this security and politics so complex sometimes, right? There are some people, their job is make the simple thing more complicated. There are some people here, there are some people back in China. So, but my way is how to make a complicated thing very simple for you to see. I think these three factors that contribute towards each other to make this world very uncertain to some extent. But anyway, as I said at the outset, the transnational security issue becomes so prominent, so important. And this, from my view, is a game changer for the future relationship among major powers. For example, like US and China, we got to work together to address all these problems. That's my first part. Let me move to the second part, is what are the tools available for us? As I mentioned that we are already in that over 20 years after the close of the Cold War. And now it is a time to really to work out some vision. But as I said, the old habits die hard. Very often we still carry the baggage of the Cold War. That is the zero-sum game. But now it is a time to say no to those mentality. We got to work together to address the security issues. So what I'm here like to say is we got to pursue a kind of new security concept. What does this mean? It actually means mutual trust, mutual benefit, equality, and cooperation. And this is also the guiding principle for China's security policy, as far as I can see, since the end of the Cold War. What does that mean to China? For example, this is a principle. How do we translate into a concrete policy? I think just very briefly, I give you an example on how China applies this concept into a policy. First of all, China, as you may know, that borders 14 country neighbors. Land border, we have land border of 14 countries. Sometimes I think, I envy you, how lucky you are. You got 2 neighbors. And so it's far easier. Sometimes, and there is a saying, it's easier to love the human beings than to love your neighbor. But, however, having said this, I will say the laboring is a huge asset for us, for China. So how to handle our relationship with our neighboring country has been a tremendous task for us. So one of the very irritating issues is about border disputes. Happily to say, up to now, China has addressed or resolved most of our land border disputes with our neighboring countries. And even there are some border disputes and maritime disputes left currently unresolved, but there is a consensus that there should not be the obstacles for us to pursue cooperation. So this is very important. Secondly, I try to mention about to engage in a regional security institution. This also has been part of China's policy particularly in Asia. You can see China is a very pretty active player in engaging all these security forum and also Shanghai Cooperation Organization, if you don't know that, SCO. And so to make China part of the framework, be part of it, so to work out the mutual trust. And the third one is we do see the economic engagement can play a tremendous part enhancing the mutual benefit and the mutual trust towards each other. As the previous panel ever mentioned out, it is China-U.S. relationship in the economic and trade sectors are tremendous complementary, and that has great potential to be part of that. So China is pretty also active engaging our trade economic relationship with all the partners and the countries around our neighbor and also above our neighbors. So that's very important. And of course, certainly, how about the terrorism? How about the non-proliferation? China has been working pretty vigorously with the international community to address all these issues. For example, the non-proliferation, it has become a very hot issue now, and I assume it will persist there for some time to come. And China has been part of the NPT, which stands for Non-Proliferation Treaty, signatory, and we are complying to the regulations of our own obligations for that. And of course, there are some problems and we need to address. Let me just move very quickly to the two very hot issues. One is the Korean nuclear issue, and it consists, it is a kind of problem with non-proliferation. And I want to lay out China's policy pretty clear and make it very crystal clear. China opposes any kind of nuclear proliferation, and particularly oppose any country who are seeking to develop a nuclear weapon, because that will violate the international obligation, international rules and norms, and we all have a due part to work with that. Secondly, I think China is hosting, by doing that, China is become a hosting and also facilitator of the six-party talk concerning the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula in order to secure the peace and stability in Northeast Asia. That's very important. Of course, we like to say one of the principles is this issue need to be addressed in a diplomatic and a peaceful way. That is also China work vigorously to restart the six-party talk, and we think that is the best instrument to deliver the issue. And similarly, the Iranian nuclear issue, and I think our principle also applied to Iranian nuclear issue. We oppose any kind of country who would like to possess a nuclear weapon. That's just no way. But in the same time, it is very important to give a diplomatic and a political chance to work together. And the political chance sometimes is very time-consuming. I try to understand some people maybe feel frustrated. It takes years of negotiation. But finally, I should tell you that it pays off. You just cannot think any kind of military means is the right answer to this. No way. One last sentence about China and the U.S. cooperation. And I think since the September 11 terrorist attack on the U.S., China and the U.S. has a terrific cooperation on anti-terrorism. We share information with each other, and we also established the mechanism and in various levels for the consultation, and that is very important. It is, I think, the formula will be there to come, and of course, beside that, we also work with our American counterparts or American colleagues on how to address the nuclear proliferation. So that's why China is working on one hand on the Korea and the six-party talk. On the other hand, China is also a vigorous part in the P5+1. P5 stands for 5 permanent UN security members plus Germany. That is a mechanism to deal with the Iranian nuclear issues. So we do see there is a lot of potential to work together. In conclusion, I think even in security, which is a very dry part of this, it is, I know it's easy to get people concerned, but I'm pretty confident we will have a win-win scenario in the future as long as we work together. Thank you very much.
Now, the U.S. and China have been engaged in security cooperation even before the normalization of relations in 1979. In fact, security cooperation began well before the establishment of our relationship back in the early 1970s. We recall that during the height of the Cold War, the two nations demonstrated that when a pressing security concern confronted Beijing and Washington, that they were able to work together. And in the height of the Cold War, that common threat came in the form of the former Soviet Union. And so despite our differences, we were able to do positive things for our own national security. And security consultations and security cooperation, as Ron just mentioned, continue today on such critical issues as the situation on the Korean Peninsula with North Korea's nuclear proliferation, on the very difficult issue of Iran, and on those threats without passports, as Ron termed them, transnational and non-traditional security threats. However, as the record is reviewed, one realizes that for the most part, U.S.-China security cooperation has mainly been of a political nature and operationalized at a high level of strategic policy coordination. It has mostly been the purview of U.S. and Chinese civilians and diplomats, not Chinese and American generals and admirals, something that we need to do better at. And so frankly, over the course of 30 years, cooperation between the two military establishments of U.S. and China has been the exception, unfortunately, and not the rule, something that must change. So with your permission, I'd like to talk a little bit today about a very narrow dimension of the U.S.-China relationship, one that is critically important but not really much in the news, and that is the U.S.-China military relationship. Because if the positive, cooperative, and comprehensive relationship that Presidents Hu Jintao and President Obama desire for our two countries is going to come to pass, then our two militaries are going to have to do a much, much better job at creating the mutual understanding and trust that it requires. So the first thing I'd like to highlight for you is that the military relationship between the U.S. and China remains the weakest link in this overall bilateral relationship and has been for many, many years. No part of this bilateral relationship has been more frustrating, slow to move forward, subject to being hijacked by domestic political forces, really, than the U.S.-China military relationship. And after decades, the actual record of operational cooperation between these two uniformed establishments is close to nil. Operational cooperation. Only in the 1980s, when the two militaries were hyper-focused on the existential threat posed by the Soviet Union, did the two organizations engage in security cooperation, and even then, it mostly took the form of the U.S. selling technologies and weapons to Chinese counterparts. But by 1989, when Sino-Soviet rapprochement was well underway, and after the unfortunate events of June 1989, when U.S. technology transfers to China stopped, the rationale for a close strategic military relationship all but went away. And so, and then at the same time, we had many strategic differences coming up to the surface, most notably the issue of Taiwan. So a second point to make is that the U.S.-China defense relationship has been the most unstable dimension of this bilateral relationship. Since 1989, now listen to this is nothing short of amazing. Since 1989, U.S.-China military relations have either been fully suspended, curtailed, or put on life support systems, barely at times, on at least 6 occasions. First, military relations were suspended by the U.S. side in the wake of the events in Tiananmen. Technology transfers stopped, never to begin again. And almost all elements of military contact stopped. Between 1989 and 1994, there was almost zero contact between these two militaries. The next break came amidst the Taiwan Straits crises in 1995 and 1996, generated by the visit to the United States by then President of Taiwan, Lee Teng-hui. In March 96, both countries pulled back from the relationship in the wake of Chinese exercises and missile shots across the Taiwan Strait and the U.S. deployment of 2 aircraft carrier battle groups. So for 2 years, there was no contact, and it was not until 2 presidential summits between Jiang Zemin and President Bill Clinton in 1997 and 1998 that the 2 militaries were back talking to each other again. Now, that only lasted for a year and a half, because in 1999, as a result of the errant bombing by the U.S. of the PRC embassy in Belgrade, which tragically resulted in 3 deaths in the Chinese embassy, the Chinese side pulled back from military relations. And then, within another year, within another 18 months, on April 1st, 2001, after the collision between a U.S. surveillance aircraft and a Chinese fighter jet off the coast of China, where the Chinese pilot tragically dies, we had another period for months and months where the U.S. side, specifically Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld at the time, pulled back from military relations in order to protest what he was claiming were unsafe practices. We had barely gotten the relationship moving again. In 2008, on the eve of leaving office, the Bush administration announces an arms package to Taiwan. The Chinese side cuts off military relations. After a year and a half, General Xu Cai-ho of the Central Military Commission visits the United States. The military relationship gets back on track. Within a year, the Obama administration announces an arms sales packet to Taiwan on the 30th of January 2010, and the Chinese side cuts off the military relationship again. It was only 3 months ago, with the visit to Beijing by Secretary of Defense Gates, that the military relationship is back on. So what I'm telling you is that after 30 years of U.S.-China relations, if you count up all the times we've been in suspension or not talking to each other, almost 9 of those 30 years, there's been no contact between these 2 militaries. Now, this depressing narrative begs a fundamental question. Why has the military relationship been subjected to this on-again, off-again cycle? One certainly could never imagine the U.S.-China economic relationship being put on hold for 5 years over a political or economic disagreement. So how do we explain all of this? Well, I don't claim to have all the answers, but let me give you a couple of my views on this. One way to explain this is that in the past, the costs associated with suspending military contacts have been perceived by both sides, incorrectly I believe, to be negligible. There have been no major cooperative defense programs between these 2 militaries, which would be endangered if the military relationship were cut off. What has been held at risk for the most part have been high-level exchanges, some discussions, Navy port calls, and professional military and academic exchanges. Not exactly the stuff of vital national security interests. So the cost has been perceived as relatively low. A second reason why this military relationship has been so unstable is that during those times when the military relationship has been in suspension, the other dimensions of U.S.-China relations have gone along, not even noticing to a certain degree that our uniformed officers were not engaged in confidence-building measures or developing the mutual and understanding and trust that is so critical between our 2 countries in this new world order. So to date, at least, problems in the military relationship have not found their way or seeped into problems in the economic or political or cultural dimensions. A third reason, I think, harkens back to something I said earlier, that U.S.-China security cooperation, and I think Dr. Ron's comments really underscore this, that U.S.-China security relations have not primarily been the purview of military officials. It's been political, strategic coordination amongst diplomats and civilian officials. As a result, suspensions in military relations have not adversely affected the ability of our respective officials to coordinate or cooperate on such important and critical issues as Iran or North Korea. So, given all of this, there is a school of thought in some quarters of both Beijing and Washington that says that using the military relationship as, quote, a pressure release valve is not such a bad idea. The cost is low, so goes the argument. The impact on the other dimensions of the relationship is presumed to be near nil, and each side can posture safely over security and defense issues without troubling the other dimensions of this very complex bilateral relationship. Now, others, on the other hand, argue against this view. I happen to be one of them, suggesting that sustainable and predictable contacts between the two military establishments is critical to the national interests of both the United States and China. The argument is that suspicions between the two militaries cannot be mitigated and miscalculation cannot be avoided if there is no contact, no dialogue, and no discussion. So Ron and I are in 100% agreement on that particular point. And there are others, and I associate with this argument, who now question whether it is still entirely possible to indefinitely isolate problems between the two defense and security establishments from the other critical dimensions of this relationship. We saw this past year when we had problems in security and military relations, how dangerously close they were coming to adversely affecting the political and the economic dimensions of the relationship. We can no longer keep these or assume to keep these dimensions isolated. So regardless of where you come down on this argument, the fact remains is that stability and predictability in the military dimensions of this relationship have yet to be achieved, and it's something that we absolutely must work to see happen. Now, up until the last few years, mutual suspicion and mistrust between the two uniformed establishments had been centered almost exclusively on the issue of Taiwan. An enduring and major reason why the two militaries have difficult relations these 3 decades is principally a function of the Taiwan issue. The reality is that the fundamental policies that the civilian governments in Beijing and Washington have vis-a-vis Taiwan de facto pit each military against the other on the issue of the island's future. How so? Beijing, and I presume to speak for Chinese colleagues, they can correct me if I'm wrong. Beijing, I believe, absolutely prefers a peaceful resolution to the Taiwan issue. But, as a sovereign nation, as is its right, China refuses to renounce the right to use force as an option under certain circumstances. And it is developing military capabilities that put Taiwan at risk. That's a fact. How about Washington? For its part, Washington's basic stance is that it supports any solution to the Taiwan issue that both sides agree to, that both people agree to, that is not involved with the use of coercion, and, making things more complicated, Washington reserves the right to sell arms to Taiwan under the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. So there you have it. The civilians have put the militaries in a difficult position. So the overall impact then of Taiwan is that U.S.-China military relations on military relations, that almost everything that the Chinese do or anything that the American military does is viewed by the other and refracted through the unfortunate prism of a Taiwan scenario. And that remains the case today. Now, since the turn of the century, the issues of contention between the PLA and the Pentagon are no longer just about Taiwan. And this is where it starts to get more complicated and gets me a little bit nervous. Because Taiwan, we've been successful, both sides, in managing this situation. But now I'm getting a little more nervous because now there are other issues on the table. In recent years, mutual suspicions have moved beyond Taiwan and into the realm of each side questioning the other side's intentions across a much broader set of geostrategic issues. Over the past few years, U.S. and Chinese government documents, speeches, and comments have begun to question the larger intentions of each country toward the other. In Washington, language in official U.S. documents has publicly underscored high levels of suspicion about the motives behind Chinese military modernization. On the Chinese side of the Pacific, official PRC assessments continue to ascribe the most hostile intentions to U.S. military activities and deployments in the Asia-Pacific region. So where the Chinese see American deployments in Asia-Pacific as part of an American containment strategy against China, as we had during the Soviets during the Cold War, the U.S., for its part, looks at what the Chinese are doing and say, they have an anti-access strategy that is aimed at keeping the U.S. out of the Asia-Pacific region. This is not a good way for each side to look at each other's motives and intentions. It is these types of mutual suspicions, some valid and some absolutely ludicrous at times, that feed the serious misperceptions when it comes to analyzing specific problems and policies. So it's against this particular backdrop that this next round of military relations, even as we sit here, is cranking up again between the Pentagon and the PLA. So where does this military relationship need to go in conclusion? First, I think we need to be very realistic and accept the fact that the U.S. and Chinese militaries are not going to be close institutionally, not the way the U.S. is close with its allies or the way China is close with some of its traditional defense partners, such as Pakistan. There are at a minimum, four factors that will delimit the art of the possible in U.S.-China defense relations. First, of course, the Taiwan issue. Second, mutual concerns about geostrategic intentions. Third, domestic politics in both Beijing and Washington. And fourth, the inherent systemic differences between these two defense establishments, which make good relations difficult even when times are great, and we could spend an entire day just talking about those. Now then, I feel like I've ruined the party. But I'm not going to be here to ruin the party. Right? What I want to tell you is that even though I've painted a less than rosy picture and given you what I think is a real reality check on the state of U.S.-China military relations, I want to tell you that I am optimistic. How can you say that after all of that? I think that all is not lost, all is not bleak, nor is it impossible for these two defense establishments to have a sustainable and reliable relationship. It is likely the case today, more than ever, that selective cooperation between the U.S. military and the PLA will in fact be desirable and necessary on those occasions when U.S. and Chinese national security interests align. And those security interests will align as we go into this globalized world. How so? In this current environment, and Dr. Ruan touched on this, the U.S. and China face myriad non-traditional security challenges that will present the opportunities for cooperation between the two militaries if they can develop the habits of cooperation that have been missing from this relationship, and if our uniformed and political leaders can muster the political will to do so. The list of common non-traditional challenges is long. Ron went through most of them. You know them: terrorism, organized crime, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and precursor chemicals for weapons of mass destruction, arms smuggling, rare species smuggling, pandemics, which is also a military issue, and non-combatant evacuation operations, as we witnessed just a couple of weeks ago from Libya, right? And so the U.S. and China can and should, and its two militaries must, find ways to work together on these sorts of issues. By doing so, they will build the critical habits of cooperation that have been dreadfully missing from this relationship for over 30 years. Now let me end with just paint you a picture for a moment. There was an event, or two events, in 1 week, the same week in March 2009, which for me talk both about the limits and the possibilities of U.S.-China military relations. In 1 week, within the span of 7 days in 2009, off the coast of China, Chinese vessels were harassing a U.S. Navy surveillance ship off the coast of China, the impeccable incident, so-called impeccable incident. However, on the other side of the world, off the Horn of Africa, the commander of the U.S. flotilla and the commander of the PLA Navy flotilla were having dinner on each other's ships, exchanging information and coordinating their activities against pirates off the Horn of Africa. So I think that this idea of the critical habits of cooperation forming are absolutely critical, and they're not going to happen unless our two nations' leaders can break this cycle of suspensions. These suspensions in military relations do nothing to solve the problems that we have. They halt and reverse hard-won momentum, they create new sets of resentments, and they make many countries in the Asia-Pacific region extremely nervous. The old saying is, when elephants collide, rabbits hide. Right? Now, probably the most important thing that this military relationship needs to achieve in the short term is to enhance our communications so that we make sure that misunderstanding does not lead to miscalculation and unnecessary confrontation. And it won't be easy to do that because we still haven't learned how to talk to each other. Our two militaries still are learning how to talk to each other, going back to what Dan Wright said on the first panel, what Martin Gold said on the first panel. Communicating is not always understanding. We've talked past each other. Even when we talk to each other, we sometimes don't believe what the other party is saying. And both parties are still being pulled by the invisible forces of domestic politics that are not clear and transparent to the other side. So this is not going to be easy to repair. Now, over the next few weeks, officials from the Pentagon and the PLA are going to be meeting to try to develop a new framework which will provide for a sustained, reliable military relationship. I think we all ought to take a moment and wish them the best of luck and hope that they actually are able to turn this relationship around, because there's a lot at stake. And I personally wish them well, and I personally want to see a better U.S.-China military relationship. So I'll end there, and thank you very much.
My question is, I think, a very important one. How can world powers adequately enforce something such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty through existing diplomatic frameworks such as the Security Council, when very powerful countries such as China tend to have very non-interventionist foreign policies? Essentially, at what point do the actions of a sovereign nation conflict with other nations' domestic security to the point where we intervene? Thank you.
That's a great question. Congratulations. So I fully prepare myself to such a distinguished audience and distinguished questions. And you point out a very important policy, actually. This is some people may have different view on that. But let me tell you honestly what I'm thinking about. You are talking about, if I understand correctly, what would be China's possible policy or policy orientation to intervene or not the other country or other sides for security reasons. I think that the benchmark for China's policy is non-interference for other countries' internal matters. This has been a very important cornerstone or a pillar of China's foreign policy. I don't think we will change that. As a matter of fact, if we look at what is happening today, even today, there is no shortage of problems and issues that created or that pop up just because of the outside intervention. So we should prepare ourselves not to stretch our arms too long, stretch our nose too far away from that. Because there are many issues that can be peacefully or diplomatically consulted on very kinds of international foreign, UN security, UN foreign or platform. And there are also numerous regional institutions. We got to talk about it. So for China, definitely we're not going to interfere in others' domestic affairs.
Very good. Okay, one more question. You have a comment?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's and strictly as a scholar and not a diplomat, as Dr. Ron is, I think that the question that you raised is something that is being debated in academic circles in China today, and that there are increasing contradictions between traditional tenets of Chinese foreign policy and the reality that today a China with a global economy is a China with global political interests and increasingly a China with global security interests. And so inside of China today, there are many scholars and government analysts who are trying to understand whether or not China's interventions policy is still valid. There are all sorts of articles. This is not Chinese government policy, just academics talking, but people in China are asking the same question that you have.
With China's enlarging economy, I wanted to know, you guys are spending more on your military, and our government is suspicious over your military spending. How can you become more transparent in your military spending so we can get rid of those suspicions?
Well, again, a great question. I assume it's certainly for me. I'll voluntarily take it. Yeah, it is a very important issue, and many people have this issue in their mind. And what China going to do when it grow bigger or stronger in the future, particularly how about China's military modernization. For your first part of the question, is China going to put more money on the military? Certainly yes. Certainly yes. I'm not just want to sugarcoat the uncertainties on that. Because China is such a big country, and we have such a daunting, well, let's say, so to speak, the territory to defend. You name a lot. The point is, on what level that will be reasonable. I think for the future, you will see, and very recently, China's military spending is go to double digit. After a couple of years, a single digit growth. Certainly, you will see the trend on that. But mind you that China's defense or military is basically in defense nature. And China does not have any military bases outside its territories. China will not send any combat personnel to outside. Of course, we send the peacekeepers. And China's military now is doing peacekeeping in the world. Let me make it very clear. China now is sending the largest contingency of the peacekeepers among P5 permanent UN 5 permanent security members. So we contribute in a peaceful way and a constructive way. Of course, in line with the UN security resolution on that. And your last part about is American suspicion for that? I mean, this is a question for David or for you to answer that. But what I like to say is that if you compare China's military spending, it's a tiny part of American military spending. So if America has the justification to spend so much on military, why not China spend such a tiny part of it on its own justification? Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that and find myself in the interesting position of taking up the cause for my friends in the Chinese People's Liberation Army for a moment. Actually, I'd like to say that over the last 10 years, the Chinese military has become much more forthcoming with basic information about its defense programs than any time that I remember. I started looking at the PLA in 1972, and I'm amazed at what you can learn in the public domain these days. In fact, 72 hours ago, the Chinese Ministry of Defense released its 7th Defense White Paper, which you can find online. And since 1998, China has every 2 years released a white paper. They now have a Ministry of National Defense spokesperson, and many of their publications you can order online or read at bookstores or libraries in Beijing. So on one hand, you're talking about levels of transparency. Yes, the Chinese defense establishment has not reached the levels of transparency that other developed and perhaps Western nations have. At the same time, they have come quite a long way in becoming more transparent. But where I would like to take just a slight issue with the premise of the question, the premise of the question is that, well, if we knew everything about the Chinese defense budget, we would feel like we had more transparency and we would have a better idea of what Chinese intentions are. I'd like to say that I think it's pretty clear what the Chinese military is doing, and you don't have to, that's another conference, not this one, and you don't have to have complete transparency on the budget to figure it out. And even if you had the figures, there will always be people who won't believe what they're seeing anyway.
Okay. In the interest of time, I think we're going to have to end it there. Please join me one more time in thanking our panelists.
Right to